insecure about their property rights, and they would find it very hard to predict when they would be able to retain those things or not. So we think it makes a lot more sense to have an organized system of government taxation rather than just a decentralized system of people stealing. So, but none of these factors show up in this simple static analysis we did where we just said, oh, you take the thing from the rich guy, you give it to the poor guy, you know, and that makes things better, right? And so what this tells us is it just doesn't make any sense to think about crime without thinking about what allowing crime would create incentives for, right? And Schumpeter would argue that this is exactly the same as industrial economics. That is, if we just think about the deadweight loss caused by monopoly, and we don't think about the incentives created by transfers, we're going to reach just as absurd conclusions as we would if we thought only about the redistributive effect of crime and not about the incentives that it creates for criminal activity or for activity to deter criminals. And so you really can't think about any reasonable policies without trying to take into account these incentive effects. And that we shouldn't, you know, I put a lot of emphasis on our dead weight loss triangle, but that is really not the main story in some sense. The main story is which products are incentivized to be created. And it's not just at this broad level, but actually in quite a bit of detail, that crime and industrial economics or intellectual property are very closely related to one another. And the basic reason is that in criminal activity, the way we try to stop people from doing it is not by fining them for committing a crime, but rather by throwing them into jail, right? And throwing them into jail is wasteful for two reasons. One is people don't like being in jail, and it's not like somebody else who puts them in jail gets a benefit out of them being in jail, whereas if they paid a fine, if it hurt them, it would help someone else, right? So it's costly because it just, whatever harm's caused to them isn't transferred to someone else. And second, it's costly because it just costs money to set up jails and to catch people and so forth. And so in order to deter crime, we have to spend money on enforcement and on punishment. In order to encourage innovation, we have to waste money by creating dead weight loss from monopoly. And so these problems are actually very closely related to one another. And therefore, before I go into IP, which is slightly more complicated, I want to go through the crime model. I also think it's a little bit more attention-grabbing than the intellectual property issue is. So in the model, each crime causes some harm, H, and receives an amount of punishment, P, which can be chosen by the government. And there's a demand for committing crimes which declines in the amount of punishment, right? The more you punish, the less crimes will be committed. That's O of P. And so the surplus to offenders, we can think of as just being like a demand curve, right? So it's just the integral underneath the demand curve above the punishment level. Administering punishment costs society C of P per offense that's committed, right? So we basically, for every offense that's committed, we have to spend some money on the police to catch those people. We have to spend some money throwing those people in jail and so forth. And so that means that there's basically two sources of inefficiency from punishment, as I said. The first is that harming the criminal, raising this P, doesn't directly benefit society in any way. It harms the criminal, and it may reduce the amount of crime, and that may indirectly benefit society, but there's no direct benefit from punishing the person. And the second one is that it's harmful to the harming the criminal directly imposes some costs on society associated with, throwing them in jail, catching them, and so forth. Yeah, Federico.
I'm just going to make a point.
Yeah.
For one, it's funny how irrational people sometimes are. For example, like yesterday, Michael Jackson's doctor got, well, at least he was guilty. And there were people everywhere crying about like how happy they were that justice was being served.
But so you said that's irrational. That's a very interesting point, Federico, because if people didn't have that feeling, what would be the problem?
Well, you wouldn't want to like put them in court and then they wouldn't get punished.
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely costly once someone's already committed a crime to put them in court and do all this stuff. So if people didn't have this feeling of like revenge, it would be very hard to credibly commit to punishing people, right? And so in some ways it's actually very useful that we've built into us this retributive instinct. Yeah, David.
But it seems like even if people didn't get the satisfaction from seeing
Yeah.
revenge taken, you would still have a deterrent effect on future potential crime committers
Yeah.
by like doing a harsh punishment, so that you would actually have some benefit besides this like sense of satisfaction.
Well, maybe, but the thing is that for any individual offender, right, you could always say, okay, we're not going to punish this guy, but in the future we're going to punish other guys. Now, I understand that in order to maintain a reputation, you might need that, and that's easier to do in a big organized society like we live in today. But if you think about a decentralized society, like hunter-gatherers or whatever, they have a much shorter history, and it's much harder for them to establish a reputation like that. And so it's more important that if justice is going to be done, that people have this retributive instinct. And so I think you can explain actually a lot of features of human psychology by the efficiency with which they enforce things like this. Similarly, authenticity. Everyone wants to have an original Picasso, right? Why? I mean, it's literally exactly identical. No one in this room could tell the difference between a Picasso and one of the knockoffs that they produce 100 of per day in Shenzhen, China. And they, the only reason why you want it is because you have some idea that it's like cool or, socially prestigious to have a Picasso. What is that? Why do you care about that? Well, it's probably an evolutionary or at least a cultural adaptation, which is trying to serve the same role that intellectual property does, right? In societies before we had organized intellectual property institutions, we still had to give people an incentive to be innovators. And we did that by having, the people who originally created something be viewed as, creating something more valuable than someone who just knocked it off. So, our goal is to choose the level of punishment to maximize social welfare. So what's social welfare? Well, it's the surplus to the offenders minus the cost to societies, which are the direct harm, plus the cost of enforcement times the number of crimes that are committed. Okay. So if we take derivatives, what do we get? We take the derivative of this, and we get negative O of P. We take the derivative of this, we get O prime times H plus C, and then minus C prime times O is equal to 0, right? So we can rearrange that by moving the O prime terms onto one side and the O terms onto the other side. And this yields Becker's famous formula for the optimal deterrence of crime. So the elasticity of crime times the ratio of the harm to the punishment should be equal to 1 plus C prime, which is the marginal cost of crime. Why is that the marginal cost of punishment? Because any amount we harm the offenders by punishing, that's part of the harm, that's the 1. And then this is the cost of increasing the amount of punishment. So this means that enforcement should be greater if the deterrence effect of enforcement is larger. So, so these are basically the marginal benefits of enforcement, right? And those are proportional to elasticity of crime with respect, right? And these are the marginal costs. So if elasticity becomes greater, then you're going to enforce more, right? You're going to have a higher level of punishment. If the marginal cost of punishment becomes lower, because it's cheaper to build prisons and so forth, you're going to enforce more. And to the extent that the harm gets larger, you're also going to enforce more. So you want to keep a pretty close to constant ratio between the harm and the amount of punishment. Okay, so this simple theory actually explains a lot of how the criminal justice system works. So one basic principle of the criminal justice system, or one basic principle that this suggests, is that punishment should be larger for offenses that are more harmful. And David, what does this correspond to in the way that our criminal justice system actually works?
Well, it seems like crimes that are premeditated and more severe receive stronger punishments.
There's a very famous catchphrase that corresponds to this, right? that you probably learned in civics class. The punishment should fit the crime,
Sure.
right? right? So, I mean, the basic principle of the punishment should fit the crime is exactly capturing this term, right? The punishment over crime ratio should be constant as long as the elasticity and the cost of enforcement are held fixed, right? Yeah.
Besides, like, someone like Richard Posner,
Yeah.
is anybody doing work like this on the criminal justice system? Because it seems like the way the law evolved had really like nothing to do with economic analysis and was much more based on like our feelings of what an equitable society would be. So, I mean, is there any like evidence to show that the development of the criminal justice system was tied to something like this?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of stuff about that. So Andre Schleifer has had a whole thing about the evolution of the criminal justice system, and in fact, he may come in the winter to give a workshop about that and how it did or did not correspond to what's efficient. But there's a surprising amount of stuff, like we saw with the economic versus purely economic versus physical damages, that was like almost perfectly aligned with the idea of a pecuniary versus a non-pecuniary externality. So the amazing thing about our legal system and our society is that institutions that developed over a very long period of time, even without much of a theoretical foundation, can end up corresponding quite closely to what we would socially want, even though they weren't planned that way. Just because, I mean, there's many things that are like that. We just sort of happen upon the right solution because it works quite well. People stay with it. So a lot of what economists try to do in normative economics is not just prescribe better policies, but try to explain things that we observe happening right now. So, for example, I have a student who, based on my work on intellectual property, did an analysis of the iPhone App Store, and basically tries to show why that's actually quite close to the optimal way to reward stuff. He tries to say, well, it's not quite optimal, and here's how you would change it. But sometimes, things that sort of have been quite successful happen upon pretty good solutions. Okay. So, second, this says that we should avoid and reduce costly punishment and try to favor less costly punishments. And Steve, what would that correspond to, or to what extent does that show up in our legal system?
I don't know, like it seems like our legal system puts a lot of people in jail, and that's very costly.
Yeah.
So it's just incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like
I think to some extent this is the one area where our legal system probably falls pretty far short of the goals. So Becker says that whenever possible we should use fines rather than criminal penalties. Now that can be very hard because a lot of people who commit crimes don't have the money to pay for the harms that they create, right? And so we're sort of forced to do things like throw them in jail. But at least in white-collar crimes, overwhelmingly, things are paid through fines rather than through jail terms. Yeah, Victor?
What about like forced community service?
That's a more efficient way. So that's one thing that would be going in that direction. That's right. As well as things like forcing people to work while they're in jail or something like that. And Becker would argue that there's many more things that should use crime and that should use fines. And when not possible, we should use cheaper ways of punishing people. So for example, Becker supports much more corporal punishment and much less jail terms because it makes it much cheaper to punish, right? So you should just whip people in the public square rather than sending them to jail because it's a lot cheaper as a way to deter them. Finally, there should be less punishment in situations where people are less elastic to the amount of punishment. And Federico, do you remember what are some examples of that?
So you would want to punish less and be less elastic because, well, I guess.
Or how does that play out in the real world?
Well, basically, if they're not going to respond much to your punishment, then you're not really getting a return on your investment in punishing.
But can you think of something